Is there any reason for the why now component of this balloon coming from Canada, for example? I'm sure that's a whole other question, but this has been ongoing, these disputes, these tensions. Why would this be a time that they would launch this test?
Well, many observers have thought that China is on a very short timeline in terms of invading Taiwan. So, for instance, there was that leaked memo of General Mike Minahan, who is the chief of the Air Force's Air Mobility Command, which said that his gut, as he put it, tells him that we're going to be fighting with China in 2025. You know, we have heard from Admiral Mike Gilday, the chief of naval operations, last October, saying we could be in a war with China at any moment. These are shortened timeframes, and I think that China, you know, to the extent that they can gather information that's not available through satellite means, you know, they just want to know more about this and testing our reactions. So this is another sign, not that we needed any more of them, but this is another sign that China is actually preparing for battle.
Yep. And comes in a year, of course, when the U.S. is hosting APEC and lots of conversations around power dynamics in the Asia-Pacific region.
It's very hard for us to judge Chinese intentions, but we can see what they're doing. They are preparing for war. They're involved in the fastest military buildup since the Second World War. They're trying to sanctions-proof their regime. And most ominously, they're preparing China's civilians for battle. You put that all together, and we have to be very concerned. We got to remember that Xi Jinping right now is facing so many domestic problems at home with, for instance,
the protests,
collapsing property prices,
yep.
Stagnating economy, worsening food shortages, deteriorating environment, COVID-19. He really could use a distraction right now. And that's why we got to be concerned that a lot of the friction that we're seeing is being driven by domestic problems.
Let me pause on one point you made. You said they're preparing the citizens for war. In what respect?
Amendments to China's national defense law, which went into effect in the beginning of 2021, take power away from the civilian state council and give it to the Communist Party's Central Military Commission. And these are powers about mobilization for war. But that's not just the only thing. We are seeing, for instance, the Communist Party cadres are going to factory owners and telling them to switch their production from consumer items to items for the Chinese military. As a matter of fact, there have been so many of these orders to domestic manufacturers that the Communist Party is actually running factories once owned by private entrepreneurs because the private entrepreneurs don't want to stick around for Xi Jinping's war, as they put it. So we can see that this is starting to be a total society effort, and we're just not paying attention. That's one of the real risks, and that is that China is preparing to go to war, and we're being oblivious.
One of the reasons that maybe this assumption we've had for the better part of certainly a generation that economic prosperity is so central to the power dynamic in China, and that economic prosperity is very tied to U.S. trade, supply chains, relationships. Is that changed as well?
It changed. Supply chains obviously had to react to the COVID-19 disease control measures in China. Zero COVID, as it was called, which was in effect until December 7th of last year. And these were among the strictest measures anywhere in the world. And of course, they clobbered supply chains. They prevented workers from going to factories. Factories couldn't get materials. And of course, logistics were affected. So yeah, companies started to see, well, they needed to have alternate sources of supply. That's China plus one, as it's called.
Yeah.
And indeed, a lot of logistics guys are not talking about China anymore. They talk about not supply chains, but they talk about supply webs, which are essentially multiple suppliers. And so companies now are less efficient because they got multiple suppliers, but they are more resilient. And that means that China is losing out to some extent.
Great. Thanks very much for joining us, Gordon.
Thank you, Diane.